Appreciate everybody dialing in. Hopefully you've either had your lunch or you're having it now, so we can kind of concentrate on the screen. Just to give you a little bit of background, I tend to like to use the slides as placeholders. Won't read them to you because I'm pretty sure that everybody who's on this is probably capable of reading themselves. So with that, let's kind of jump right in. And we're talking about monitoring not being enough, and I want to get to that in a bit. First, we need to have the sort of the obligatory slides that we all talk about, which is why is third-party risk important? And more often what we're seeing is everybody thinks third-party risk is important. They know that they're giving access to systems, they're giving their customer data and their company confidential data to third parties. But the spend still seems to be primarily focused on internal cybersecurity issues. And the simple truth is, at some point in time, no matter how much more money you spend on your own cybersecurity measures, you're not going to protect your data any better than you are today, because that data lives outside your four walls. So it really is important at some point in time in the process, and we see more and more companies starting to open the checkbooks because they realize that they've got to start spending money, start allocating resources to managing those things that live outside their four walls. And this is pretty important because criminals are really focusing on your vendors. The list here of just some of the third-party data breaches, and I know it's interesting when we think about Equifax, that doesn't always jump to mind as a third-party service provider, but that's all Equifax is. Equifax provides credit bureau information and other services to financial institutions and other people who want to know whether or not an individual is a good credit risk. They're sort of the ultimate third party and the ultimate demonstration that says, wow, if I want to get at a bank's customers, what's a good way for me to do that across multiple banks, right? For criminals, this is a business, and they're looking on return on their investment. So if they can invest money and hack Equifax, they get access to how many hundreds, thousands of financial institutions' customer lists, as opposed to making that same investment or a similar sized investment of just hacking an individual institution. What we're seeing more and more, 63% of data breaches are linked to third parties. The criminals are smart. It's easier for them to get in because in most cases, the vendors, while Equifax isn't an example of this, small vendors like Larson Studios, who was the vendor who was breached as part of the Netflix hack, they're smaller. They don't invest things. Larson Studios didn't realize that they needed to update and patch their Microsoft XP systems, okay? So criminals are they're a better target. The other piece is the growth in IoT devices. And I think this is going to be really more and more troubling because folks who are manufacturing and the scenarios in which you're using more IoT devices are not people who think about data security, okay? One of the best examples of using an IoT device to get into things happened in Las Vegas at one of the casinos. Casinos like to have big aquariums. They like to have big visual effects. This particular casino had quite the aquarium system and complexes in there, and the people who serviced that for them hooked up some monitoring so they could look at water quality, water temperature, and all the things they needed to do to keep all these very expensive exotic fishes alive. Well, those monitoring devices had to get to the internet somehow, so they hooked into the Wi-Fi at the casino, which is also where all of their financial operations were done. So someone was able to actually breach and get into the internet device that was used to monitor the aquariums and use that to leverage their way into the financial systems of the casino. We don't think about that. And those are all different devices that are being provided by third parties. The other big piece that we get, and this is only some, this even actually still needs to be updated for 2018, that more and more regulatory pressure is coming. And that's hitting us really broadly. What's not on here is California's recent privacy regulation. Colorado in the last 30 days has adopted an additional one as well. And the reason why regulatory impact is important is it's now starting to go beyond industry sectors. When we look at California, we look at GDPR, we're seeing regulations that are focused on just having customer data, not just the industry you're in. And the rest of the world outside of the US doesn't necessarily focus as much on industry, they focus on the type of data. And we're seeing that now start to creep its way into the states with California. There's a bill pending in New York State as well around data breaches that also says we don't care what company, what industry you're in, we just care if you have New York State residents' data. So regulations is continuing to push this, and it pushes it because, as in the case of HIPAA violations, there's not a lot of enforcement from the Office of Civil Rights, from OCR and HIPAA. But where people are getting hit for HIPAA violations is when there's a breach at one of their vendors, that breach is investigated and it's determined that the covered entity, the healthcare provider in this instance, wasn't doing and exercising their regulatory responsibilities for managing their vendors, in that case, business associates. So one way or another, it comes around to haunt you. So what does third-party risk management look like today? Most of the time, and we have to remember that even though third-party risk management has been around for a long time, shared assessments started doing this in 2005 as a focused approach within financial services and with the big four the AICPA firms. It's been around for a long time, but it's still fairly immature and it's still somewhat dispersed. So we still see a lot of manual processes, right? We have to figure out who our vendors are, what do they do? I actually continue to be surprised when I work with customers and potential customers or go to conferences and events, only to find out that most companies still do not have an accurate and complete vendor inventory. They do pretty good with new vendors, with new onboarding, but they don't necessarily know exactly who their vendors are, what data their vendors have, what systems they access, and physically where do they provide the services. Frankly, without that, you really can't manage your vendor risk. So this is sort of, the typical infrastructure issues that we have: lacks of resources, the difficulty to complete assessments on time because the businesses are driving it so hard. They want new services, and they want those services now, or they want to expand what a vendor does for them. So there's just a lot of pressure from an infrastructure standpoint of what he does. But what's the practical reality? Right? What do we hear? Well, we hear there's too many questions, right? It's too expensive. Vendors won't cooperate. The companies don't scope well. Let's talk about a couple of these. I wrote a blog just a short while ago, and I'm always very entertained when people say, you're asking the vendor too many questions. Vendors should be able to respond to us in 200 questions or less, and we should be good. And it's always interesting when somebody says that, then you then start to inquire them, well, gee, what about application security? Do they provide you with an application? Yes, well, you ought to ask about that. How about remote access to your systems and your data? Yep. And as you go through the list of all the risk areas, I've never had anybody say that no, if that's what's going on at the vendor, because they've got confidential regulated data and sensitive system access, I need to know all those things. Well, you can't know all those things if you're starting with, I have to know this in X questions. It's really about knowing what you have to ask. So, the thought that there's a magic number of questions isn't really appropriate. It's really about scoping things. But this is sort of what we hear, and it is bad that companies don't scope. They don't properly scope what's going on, and that's quite often why you see vendors not cooperating. You're not asking questions of the vendors that are tied in with what they want to do. So this is sort of the practical reality of what we hear when we're looking at TPRM, third-party risk management. So let's talk a little bit about assessments themselves. And we all know that they're costly, they're time-consuming. First you have to scope everything all out and decide what you want to ask. Then you have to ask it, you have to review it. But the risks that we're having to deal with within third parties is continuing to grow. Well, we got cloud providers now, we got application security, we have the Internet of Things, we have downstream vendors. The practical reality is that vendors are making the same business decisions that companies are making about what they should be doing internally. And a lot of times they're outsourcing, which means that that vendor may be subcontracting out services that they provide to you. And I tend to use the term vendor subcontracting. I think that's easier to follow. We all think of it in the terms of, if I hire a general contractor to build my house, I know that that general contractor is going to hire plumbers and electricians, and they're going to come in and they're going to do work. They're doing it for me. They're building my house, but they're doing it through this general contractor, and I don't really have any direct control because I don't have a direct contractual relationship with the plumbers, the electricians. So I'm got to make sure that that general contractor is doing what they need to do. The approaches that we're using in TPRM are continuing to expand. We've got questionnaires, attestations, we have new SOC certifications. We're now going more towards virtual assessments as a way to limit being on site. Risk scoring, which we're going to get to in a minute, is becoming more and more popular and is quite the focus by Gartner. And now we also have continuous monitoring. So what does all this mean? It means that our assessments are really expensive, and they're taking us more time because there's more pieces to them, and there's more ways that we have to do them and more ways that we have to exercise them, right? But here's the problem. The assessment itself isn't enough. While we have to do them, they only provide us a snapshot. It's a point in time. Even if you are on site at a vendor, it's still an on-site and on a point in time perspective. Same thing with attestations and certifications. The threat environment changes rapidly. Vendors change processes and procedures. They will subcontract out things that they do. Something they did for you 6 months ago may now be subcontracted out to another company. Plus, the assessment is only looking at what happens within the four corners of your vendor contract. Okay, it's looking at what are the requirements that I'm imposing on this vendor around IT security and data privacy. Assessments don't look at threat intelligence. They don't look at the broader perspective. They're not looking at factors that can disrupt the vendor's ability to provide you with services. Okay? And this is becoming a more growing trend that we're not only looking at data the vendors have, systems that vendors have access to, but one of the things in risk rating a service and deciding we have to assess a vendor is availability. How important is that vendor service to my company's ability to deliver things that drive revenue? And in that instance, you find providers, whether it's Thomson Reuters, whether it's journal feeds, whether it's Bloomberg, you're finding third-party services that while they don't have your customer data, their services to you is so critical that without them, you immediately lose money and you have revenue at risk. So you really have to look very closely at these issues that can disrupt vendor services. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about continuous monitoring, and we're going to dig into that specifically a little bit deeper. So we have assessment due diligence that we have to get. We've got threat intelligence information we have to get, and we have to get it on an ongoing and updated basis, because we're finding now that it's not enough to know what the status of the vendor was in June and what the status of the vendor is going to be next June or 2 years from June. We have to see if there's anything going on with that vendor that could impact what their ability to deliver to us tomorrow. Okay. So I got to thinking, is there a silver bullet here? I did a little Google search just for fun, and I did a Google search for third-party risk silver bullet, and I got just short of 10 million results. Now that tells me that if there's almost 10 million different silver bullets, that there really isn't any single silver bullet. And I've actually been involved in a lot of different silver bullet exercises in the past. The push in the early 2000s around federated IDs. We were going to solve all our authentication problems because we were going to go with federated IDs, and people were going to all log in the same way across systems, across multiple companies. It didn't work. Anti-phishing solutions, online brand and reputation protection. There's been a look, and I've been involved in a lot of different areas of looking for silver bullets, and they're difficult, if not impossible, to find. In my mind, they're almost like the bespeckled, bedazzled unicorn. But let's see, because there are some things going on that are being touted as a potential silver bullet, and that's scoring vendors. Scoring vendors has been embraced by Gartner. They believe that security ratings, this is a quote that I have from Gartner, that they're going to be as important as credit ratings, right? And over the next 6 years, they're going to be the mandatory precondition for determining business relationships. Okay, so wow, vendor security scoring, could that be a solution here? Could this be our silver bullet? Well, what is this vendor security scoring? Well, it's generated through externally observable data. Okay, they claim not to be intrusive, and I believe that most of them are not. Some of them, I wonder how they get the data and information that they claim to have without somehow being intrusive somewhere, but that's a topic for another day. So they're not penetration. So they're looking at external observable data about systems, about websites. They're gathering information like we do with our threat monitoring service about what's happening in various places, what's happening in various systems, and what's going on. So it's as much external information as you can get, and then they're going to analyze all of this and use some fairly sophisticated algorithms to come up with a score. And that score is supposed to give you a clear picture of the vendor's security posture in certain areas. Okay? Whether you got high score means good or high score means bad, depends on the perspective. But in either way, you get a score, and through these external observations, the silver bullet is that I can make conclusions about how secure a vendor is. And if you think about that, you have to think about whether or not does that really make sense? What's the causal connection here? What's the logical link? With some of the things that I've looked at for this, I see a lot of claims, but I'm not seeing a lot of analysis and a lot of support for how I get from point A to point C. You know, what's happening in point B that allows conclusions to be reached. So here's the practical reality. We talk about vendor scoring. And on part of what Gartner says, I will agree. I agree that scoring, that externally observable data, and we'll talk in a minute that the regulators agree with part of this too, is a piece of the component. It's a sliver. It provides you with some level of insight. And I actually feel fairly passionate about this. I think folks need to remember and understand that it is only providing you with some level of insight. It's providing you with some type of a risk indicator that gives you an opportunity to have a dialogue or conversation. But these scores are not truly specifically actionable information about type of correction action needed. They don't rise to the level of me finding out that the vendor is not training somebody, or they don't have a secure SDLC. It's not providing me with the granular level of information that I can know what controls aren't in place and what corrective action may need to be taken, right? These are simply KRIs. as KRIs, they still have value, but they're not specifically detailed information. But the other problem with a lot of the security scoring is they don't give you a full picture of continuous monitoring components. A lot of them are single-threaded, and they may be looking at IT security issues or data security issues, but they're not looking at the full spectrum of continuous monitoring factors. And we're going to talk about the definition of that. We saw a piece of that before, but what constitutes continuous monitoring and all of the things that you're supposed to look at in that external view have been defined. And it's more than just security. Now, the external look at security may give you some ability to question or have a dialogue when viewed against the perspective of a vendor's response to questionnaires, or certifications and attestation reports that you have, but they have to be viewed in that context. Standing alone, they don't really provide a good comparative picture. So we're going to see in a minute that while the assessments are big and troublesome and whatnot, they're still a critical part of the equation. So vendor security scoring as a silver bullet, no, it can be used as another bullet, right? As part of the bullet in your gun, but it's not going to be the end all be all. And I am concerned when I see companies out there who are just simply using scoring as their way to make onboarding decisions, or as use as a primary component or variable in their risk management program. Their KRIs that have to put into the context of an assessment to really be actionable and help you know what to do next. And certainly, please, for those of you who agree, disagree, think I've lost my mind here or am missing important parts, please throw some comments and questions into the chat dialogue so we can address them later, because that's part of what this is all about, is not just hearing from me, but having an opportunity to talk about and address some of your questions. So if there's no real silver bullet, okay, what do we do? Well, you've got to have a comprehensive TPRM program. I'll use a quick military analogy. The military uses a lot of different weapons: land, sea, air. And they do that because there are a lot of different threats coming from a lot of different places, a lot of different kinds that are always changing. That's why our military doesn't have just one weapon, or it doesn't just use that one weapon in one particular arena or scenario. They've got to cover everything. And when we look at having a comprehensive TPRM program, the OCC has really done a pretty good job of telling us what that is. And even if you're not regulated by the OCC, I would suggest that you should educate yourself on what those requirements are, because more and more we see other industries adopting those parts of the regulatory framework that make sense to them as best practices. And the OCC approach is really a fairly best practice driven thing. So what does the OCC tell us? Right, and the OCC's approach is also very similar to what it is in healthcare. But I'm going to talk about the OCC approach because it's the one that's been the most clearly and succinctly articulated. You have to have a risk-based approach to vendor risk rating, right? And vendor risk rating, for those of you who've seen any of my other activities, what you're risk rating is the risk of outsourcing a particular service. And then that's your inherent risk, and then you're saying, okay, how well do different vendors who could do this address and lower that risk? So it's really about the vendor's risk rating starts from the risk that they've assumed, and they've assumed it, but you're still responsible for it in providing that service. Then doing, vendor due diligence, doing those assessments based on that inherent risk of the service. Okay. Collaborating on assessment, due diligence, and ongoing monitoring. And we're gonna talk about collaboration more, but the regulators have come out and said that collaboration is fine. In fact, I was involved about 4 years ago. Shared Assessments did a collaboration project with 3 of the top 5 financial institutions. And we had the OCC as sort of an active spectator. They agreed to boo if I was going in the wrong direction and quietly applaud if we thought we were going in the right direction. And the OCC was very specific in saying, we don't care how you get the data, we care what you do with it. So as long as you get the data that you believe you need and you act on that data, we don't care how it's collected. And we're gonna dig into that a little bit further. They also said, establish user groups, get together, form user groups of people, of firms and companies that use like vendors for like services, right? There's synergy there. Use standard questionnaires. It makes things easier on everybody. And engage in continuous monitoring. So that's sort of what they're saying. It needs to be part of your TPRM program, right? You've got to do it in a risk-based way, and you've got to have all of these components and elements. How you decide to exercise them and organize them is necessarily going to be very dependent on what industry you're in, the nature of your company, how your company is structured. But you've got to be addressing all of these different areas. And I want to talk a little bit about continuous monitoring, because I unfortunately, and I have to admit to being culpable, in part of the issue I have with the term continuous monitoring doesn't really tell us what it is. We can continuously monitor a lot of things. Right now in North Carolina, South Carolina, they're continuously monitoring river levels to see when flooding is finally going to abate. We can continuously monitor website uptime to make sure that performance standards for website uptime are met. But continuous monitoring has been defined, and I mentioned this earlier, it's been defined by the financial regulators as that which looks beyond the 4 corners of the contract and is looking at those things that would disrupt the vendor's ability to provide you with services. Specifically, in looking at the threat environment, we are told that we should be looking at breach incidents and events, legal and regulatory actions, financial liability, operational issues, brand and reputational issues. Okay? And for some of those, what you're looking for is there a lawsuit pending against this company that could disrupt what they do for us? I had that happen with one of my customers who was looking to replace Oracle for a particular service, only to find out after they had gone with that vendor that Oracle had a lawsuit pending and was able to successfully get an injunction against this company for a business patent. So suddenly now the vendor could no longer provide this service. They were permanently enjoined. And the customer had to go back, deal with the interruption in the service, and go back and pay more money now to Oracle to reinstate things. So legal actions, regulatory actions. Is there something happened with mergers and acquisitions that can affect operational issues? These, again, are KRIs. These are things that tell you what's going on. One of the more important things to be looking for in continuous monitoring is actually phishing activity. The recent statistics show that the majority of data breach incidents, whether they happen at vendors or they happen internally at companies, start with a phishing incident. A phishing incident may have payload, may have malware attached to it, or it may just be something that tricks someone into giving up their credentials to a fake website. Okay. But it's very important then to know if your vendors are subject to significant phishing activity, particularly phishing activity that has payload attached to it. I can get a little passionate about this. I'll have to watch myself because I ran the anti-phishing programs at 2 of the banks. So I have a feel for how pervasive this can be. But if you've got a vendor and they're subjected to a significant uptick in phishing activity, you probably want to have a conversation with them to make sure, one, that they're aware that that's going on, and two, what are they doing about it, right? That's some of the things that you're asking for, right, when you're doing your assessment, is you want to know about their anti-phishing programs. But now is a good reason and another trust to have a dialogue. So again, this is part of it, okay? And what this allows you to do, and sort of those of you who've listened to me before know that my phrase that pays is continuous monitoring allows you to be proactive rather than reactive, and to address issues before they become incidents, okay? And that's really how you can tell senior management and the board that you're doing things. We are looking not only at the controls of our critical key business partners, right? That's who your vendors are. We're not only looking at the controls they have in place, but we're also looking and having a dialogue with them if we see something of significance going on that could disrupt their ability to provide us with services. That's how you have management and the board comfortable, put your mind in the store, and your customers comfortable, put your mind in the store. So how do you make this work? We got a lot of moving parts. Prevalent has, for some time now, taken a very unified approach to this complexity. And we look at the three primary components here, which is assessing the vendor, monitoring the vendor, and sharing information, collaborating and sharing information is our mantra. It's how we proceed. So what does each one of these mean, right? Well, within the assess quadrant, you really got to assess your vendor's risk, right? And we know that that's a timely and costly and time-consuming effort. And mainly that's because it's done by most people in a very manual way, okay? And when you do that, you have highly skilled risk professionals engaging in administrative and clerical activities, okay? By collecting information, collecting due diligence in a risk-based way, based on risk criteria, based on the type of services the vendors are providing to you, you limit the amount of time that your risk professionals have to spend doing non-risk related activities. Now, why is that important? Well, it's critically important because, one, there's not that many skilled risk professionals out there. Two, they probably have to do far more assessment activity than they can do given their workload. So every activity, every minute that you free up from an assessor to do risk-based activity is going to directly increase their throughput. We've looked at it, and this goes back to my days when I was program director at Shared Assessments, and the numbers have stayed fairly the same. If you are involved in a manual process for doing assessment due diligence, your people are spending, no matter how much time they spend doing an assessment, somewhere between 40 and 60% of that, so basically half, will be spent just collecting and validating vendor data and information, okay? That's a big number. So you think about driving some efficiency through that and helping people manage that process, and it becomes extremely important, right? And within that, it's not just about that, but it's all of the risk-based activity that goes into vendor assessment automation, right? It's using standardized content. It's having operational workflows happening in one place, okay? It's having all that accountability and having the vision to be able to see what is happening with all of my assessments across all of my vendors at any one point in time with one view. Now, that's not only important operationally so that you can see what's happening and you can manage that process, but forensically, from a reporting standpoint, it's critically important. I've had the pleasure of running point on both internal audits and external regulatory examinations. And when I think about, doing things in a manual way, I think about what happens when 18 months have gone by and I have an examiner or an internal auditor that says, why did you make this decision about vendor X? And if I'm doing this manually, I now have to go in, I have to find out who worked that, Hopefully that information has been stored somewhere or has not been deleted from their email system, right? So I'm scrounging through Outlook. If I'm lucky, some kind of documentation of that will be in a SharePoint folder somewhere. But that's going to be the case for every question that I get asked, is I'm going to have to go on a hunting expedition to find why decisions were made and what information and data was gathered to support that. Okay. If you've got a unified platform that does that, all of your forensic and accountability information is in one place. What information, due diligence, whatnot that you've collected from the vendor. Conversations with that vendor for clarification and additional documentation. Decisions are recorded. Those decisions are not only recorded and justified and timelined, but people who have to sign off on those decisions are recorded as well. So in one place, regardless of how many different people you have doing this, over what amount of time, you have one repository where you can find out and track forensically any decisions and everything that you've done as part of your vendor risk assessment program. That audit trail is incredibly important, and just simply adds more value to being able to operationalize that process and see it. But what about continuous monitoring and scoring? Well, as I said, risk scoring may not be a silver bullet, but it's still an important part, right? And what you're looking for is leading indicators. We actually have embedded, again, in one unified platform, assessment information and continuous monitoring and risk scoring live together. So you don't have to go to different places. You don't have to go to different systems to get a complete picture of what the risk is presented by this vendor, okay? You're going to be able to look at what it is and, again, have a vehicle for receiving notifications. You can't possibly look at all this information. You need to have some notifications and controls with it. I know when I was running the anti-phishing programs at the banks, I also was responsible for managing misuse of corporate names, trademarks, what have you. And I had some pretty good manual processes for that. I then went and had some automated processes for that. But the failing with that is I had to log into those. They were good systems, but I had to log into those and go and review reports to see if anything of importance had happened that I might have to act on. That could be a full day's activity just to scroll through and read through and see if anything important had happened. And if anything important hadn't happened, that was 8 hours, 10 hours, depending on the day that I needed to get back. So a good monitoring system is going to provide you with notifications. That's what ours does. You can set the standards, you can set the requirements, and say if it's a brand or reputational issue, it has to have a risk score of X or greater for me to be concerned about it. And when that happens, I want to receive a notification, because I don't want to have to go in and look at the 350 different vendors we're monitoring to see if something's going on. I want to receive a notification, and I want to do it based on the different risk areas that are covered. I want to have some amount of detail in that notification, and I want to score. Again, the key here is in one unified, one comprehensive place to be able to have my risk professionals doing risk-related work and not having to push themselves into doing a lot of busy work to see what risk-related work they need to be doing, okay? And what this does is it really complements your assessment information. It allows you to see what's changing over time, okay? And gives you, a full scope of the vendor's risk profile. Now I see everything in one place, and I can record how I interact with that and decisions that I make all in one place for further use, okay? So what's the third piece of this? We talked about assessments. We've talked about continuous monitoring, threat intelligence. But what about this collection, this network data collection, collaboration, sharing? What's that all about? Well, it's taking the assessment process and the threat monitoring process, and moving it even further ahead. So if you are part of a network, and we have several networks that are operating right now, you've decided that you want to onboard a new vendor you've never assessed before. Okay. Well, even with an automation process to send that out and collect it and score it for you, you still have to go through that exercise. The vendor still has to respond, depending upon what due diligence you're asking from the vendor and your personal SLAs. That can take anywhere from a week to a month, or perhaps longer, just to get in the information that you need to have. Now, if you're part of a network, that data has already been collected for you. So think of the lift programmatically you get when a business unit is pushing for you to assess a service to determine if they can bring it online, and you can go in, pull up that vendor, and have immediate access to that vendor's assessment, due diligence information, and threat monitoring in one place. Okay. We have tens of thousands of vendors in our network, which makes it easy to do. We run a network called the Legal Vendor Network, and we're finding now that we've built up enough networks, enough vendors in the network, that recent members are coming in because in the legal arena, law firms use a lot of the same vendors to do a lot of the same things. We've seen overlap of 60%. And what that means is a new law firm comes into the network and they find that 60% of the vendors that they want to assess have already got completed questionnaires and vendor threat monitoring information available to them. Think about how quickly that expedites your process. And I know I do a number of CISO briefings, and when I talk to the CISOs about this, I said, wait a minute, so there's no lag. There's no delay then from the time we say we need to understand this vendor's threat posture and being able to do that work and make those decisions. So that's right. It's an immediate response. And what we're doing now is we're working more with the vendors to try and get more and more of them in and have those be validated. So the other piece as we move the networks forward is letting the vendors update their information, right? That will also speed up the process of doing annual reassessments. If vendors are able to go in as they improve things, be able to update their security posture, or be able to respond to threat monitoring findings. And the vendors then are able to present in a timely fashion the truest, most complete picture of what their threat environment looks like. Not only does that substantially enhance everyone's experience doing vendor risk management, but it also reduces the cost and time, because if it's fresh and it's current, even when I come up for an annual assessment, if I'm a vendor, the only thing I'm looking for is what hasn't changed since the last time I updated this, right? So it truly expedites the process. And we're finding that within the networks, that's a state of continuous improvement as we refine this and it becomes more mature. But boy, does it allow people, particularly folks who are fairly immature, who are new to third-party risk management, it really lets them jumpstart their process, okay, and get going quickly by having access to immediately be able to consume assessment and threat monitoring information is just incredibly valuable to new programs. So that's how we deliver business value. I'll admit a little bit of a hook of talking about how scoring isn't enough, but it's not enough. And it concerns me when I see companies over-relying on something that really isn't more than a key risk indicator that allows a dialogue to be initiated, to rely on that as some meaningful substantive indication of a vendor's security posture. Right. By looking at a unified platform, what Prevalent produces and delivers here, we're really able to provide greater time to value. Programs are up and running. If you're in the network, you've got immediate access to information, and information that is scored based on industry best practices, so that you can go in and prioritize your work effort based on how risky you see different things are, and to develop your remediation efforts. Be able to do that within a defined workflow that you can customize for your organization. And again, as I mentioned, everything in that platform happens in one place. So you've got true forensic accountability, true ability to visually see what's going on, and to support long-term risk management activities and decisions that you're making.